Hello and welcome to The Briefing, a weekly conversation with leaders and experts to explore the ideas shaping our democracy today. I'm Michael Waldman, President and CEO of the Brennan Center for Justice. Our politics today can be described as dysfunctional, as divided, as polarized. We've seen a mounting arms race over redistricting in the states, hundreds of lawsuits challenging the extraordinary executive assertion of power by President Donald Trump. We just finished the longest shutdown of the government in American history. There's a lot of evidence that things have gone wrong. In the new book, American Covenant, the conservative scholar Yuval Levin makes an insightful, I think, argument for how the Constitution was designed specifically for moments like this. He argues that the framers accounted for a fractured and divided society and set up a system that compels us to find common ground and act together. At least that was the goal. And he believes that can be something that really is relevant today. I'm pleased to be joined by Yuval to discuss this book and the path forward for our democracy. Yuval Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. He is also a regular contributor to the National Review and the New York Times, and he previously served in the Domestic Policy Office of the George W. Bush White House. This book is really stimulating. It's one of those books, for me at least, where I'm marking up each page with check marks and yeses or arguing with you in the margin. So it really gives a lot of very interesting and innovative thought to the real challenges we're facing, I think, in our country, in our governance right now. And I'm really thrilled to be able to talk with you about it. Broadest question is, why did you write this book and why now?
Well, thank you very much. First, I appreciate that, and it's great to be with you. The book is a kind of reintroduction to the Constitution through the lens of national unity or the idea of political cohesion. And it seemed like the right time to write a book like that, because I think we find ourselves obviously in a very divided time in American life, and it's easy to attribute that division to the American constitutional system. The Constitution frustrates us a lot of the time. It's very often what we're fighting about, and so it feels like it's a source of division in our society. But I think that it's important for us to see that the Constitution was intended to help us address the divisions that are inherent to our society, that it's there to help an unavoidably divided and diverse society govern itself and address its problems, and that it offers us some tools, including, I think, a conception of unity that would be very, very useful for us now and that we're not as familiar with as we ought to be. And so it seemed like the right time for a reintroduction and the right moment for thinking about how in the world we might help ourselves be a little less divided in a time that feels so broken.
Why is that kind of unity important, and is it even attainable? One of the elements of the genius of the Constitution that Madison brought to this, James Madison, was his insight that you actually could have more ability to have the parts of the society, the factions, the divisions, be constructively addressed in a larger polity rather than the smaller ones, which they kind of had thought before. But could he have imagined a country as large as ours with as many racial, religious, and many other divisions? In other words, why does that notion of unity matter now as opposed to being something to look back at fondly but not really so relevant today?
Well, I think one thing that comes across from an engagement with the thinking of that generation that wrote the Constitution is that although they seem to us like they were a much more cohesive and unified kind of America, they seem to themselves like a very divided and diverse society. And relative to the world they knew, they were a very diverse and divided society. The United States at the end of the 18th century was very religiously diverse. There was a diversity of national origins. We don't think of it that way now because they were mostly Europeans, aside from, of course, Africans brought here against their will. But they understood themselves as both a more vast society and a more diverse society than any of the European nations. The United States, in fact, was larger already at the end of the 18th century than any of the European nations. And the problem they were working to confront was the danger of division and of social breakdown. That's especially true for James Madison. This book is a very Madisonian book because Madison really stands out in that generation for worrying about the challenge of division. You find a lot of people in that generation, like Thomas Jefferson, who are worried about what we might think about now as social justice and equality. You find a lot of people like Alexander Hamilton worried about what we might think of as social order and dynamism. Madison is practically alone in thinking about social cohesion and the challenge of unity. And, we think of him as worried about faction and the kind of a diverse politics, and that is what worries him. But the fundamental concern that hangs like a dark cloud over his constitutional thinking is the danger of civil war, of civil breakdown. He takes civic peace to be the great aim, and he thinks it will be very, very hard to achieve. And I think he offers us a lot to think about now, because we certainly are a more diverse society than the America of the 18th century. But the basic challenges we face still have to do with how are people who think so differently about what politics is for and what our priorities should be supposed to live together as one country. And Madison offers, both implicitly and explicitly in his political thinking, a way to define that goal that I think is very useful to us now. He assumes diversity. He assumes we're not going to agree. He says this very plainly and bluntly and repeatedly. And you find in Federalist 10, for example, one of the cleanest expressions of this. He says, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed, period. So if we're free, we're not all going to think alike. And yet Madison also always insists that we shouldn't give up on the possibility of being one society. And the reason is that unity for him doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. His question is, how can people who aren't going to think alike find ways to act together politically? And what's supposed to happen in the political arena is finding ways to agree on courses of action without always agreeing on underlying premises and priorities and philosophy. And a politics that can make that possible is the politics he aims at. The obvious question that kind of formulation has to raise is how? How are we supposed to act together when we don't think alike? And I think the U.S. Constitution is a series of answers to that question. How can we act together when we don't think alike? That's what the institutions are for. That's what federalism is for, and Congress and the presidency and the courts. It's not all they're for, obviously, but it's an important part of the reason they're structured the way they are. And I think for those of us now struggling to understand the logic of the American Constitution, to see where it might need to be changed and where it might need to be reinforced, understanding that purpose is really essential.
Well, and what's one of the things that's compelling about the book is you really focus on the original Constitution, and much less so on the 14th Amendment, on the Bill of Rights, and so many of the other things that have often been the things people think about, talk about, get entranced by, and use in constitutional law. One of the things that is so striking, and you say this throughout the book, but it's actually a rather bizarre fact, is that we are a 50-50 nation. In a few weeks, we're going to be doing a podcast on the anniversary of Bush v. Gore. And quite literally, we had basically a tied presidential election. We have this 50-50 nation, and that is a very unusual thing. There is usually sort of a sun party and a moon party over time. Why do we have now several decades of trench warfare, in effect, between two very evenly divided political tendencies, two parties, but not just the parties? Why are we so divided in that way?
Yeah, I think this is actually what stands out most about 21st century America as a matter of political life. It's not so much that we're polarized, we are, but we've had a two-party system most of the time for 200 years. When you have two parties, they're polarized. They exist to restrain and resist each other. What stands out now is that we're deadlocked. And that really is very unusual, and we don't think about that enough now. You look in at American politics at almost any moment in our history, and you would find a majority party holding together a very confusing and complicated coalition. Doesn't make any sense on paper, but it works, and struggling to sustain that coalition. And you see a minority party working to broaden its own coalition and become the majority. And then you have certain kinds of transformative elections where the majority becomes a minority for a while and vice versa. But those two parties are both involved in coalition building. They understand their role as broadening their reach. For the last 25 years, we've had two minority parties at the same time. And the longer that goes on, the less that those parties are actually engaged in coalition building. They are engaged in coalition maintenance because they have 50% of the vote in just about every election, roughly, and they can't afford to lose anyone. They're focused on getting their voters out more than they are on winning people who might not belong in either coalition naturally. And the knack for coalition building has gradually been lost in our politics. What you find from looking at the Constitution through the lens of the challenge of unity is that coalition building is the essential skill in American political life. That's the way to work the system, is to build broad coalitions, because the American system is different even from other democracies in the world in that it refuses to empower narrow majorities. In order to have real power, you have to broaden your majority. And when we live in an extended period of only narrow majorities, we find ourselves very frustrated with the Constitution. What the system wants us to draw from that is that we need to broaden majorities. The parties have to work at building and broadening their appeal. But instead, they will lose an election narrowly and think, well, if we just do exactly the same thing next time, we'll win next time. And they do. They're right. And then they win an election narrowly. They persuade themselves that this is a big transformative change, and now we own the future. And look, all the groups moved in our direction. And you end up learning nothing.
You and I both worked in White Houses. I worked for Bill Clinton, and you worked for George W. Bush. And the consistent determination of everybody who narrowly wins an election to assume they've just won a historic landslide and the people have demanded whatever it is they're doing is one of the constants.
It's unbelievable, and it's gotten more and more so in the course of this century as elections have actually gotten narrower. So Donald Trump won 49% of the vote in the last election, and it's been treated by his supporters as though this was a massive landslide. Joe Biden did something similar. Control of Congress is now extremely narrow. Before I worked for George W. Bush, I worked for Newt Gingrich in his last couple of years as Speaker. And I distinctly remember after the 1998 election, where Republicans had lost a few seats in a midterm, and they didn't expect to, we had a call with Newt the day after the election. He was home in Georgia, and we were all in Washington. He was on the speakerphone, and he says, well, you know, our majority is down to 18, and I just don't know how we run the House with an 18-seat majority. And, of course, now the Speaker has a 3-seat majority, or 2, and the last Democratic Speaker also had 3-seat majorities. It's really hard for the system to work like this. And what that should mean is that both parties try to broaden their coalitions, but the dynamics and incentives that are created by an extended 50-50 period mean that this is hard for the parties to see. They don't really grasp that they're not winning, and so that they need to change their strategy. I would say one more thing. There's been one other period like this in American political history at the end of the 19th century, from roughly the 1876 election until McKinley's election at the end of the century. You had a 50-50 politics where control of Congress kept going back and forth. There were a lot of single-term presidencies. You had 2 presidents elected in that period who won the electoral vote but lost the popular vote, as we have. You had a president in that period who served one term, then lost re-election and came back after a term, as we've now seen. And the dynamics of that period were very much like this one. It was a terrifying walk on the brink of political disaster and legitimacy crisis for an extended period. And it only ended when one of the parties recognized, in that case it was the Republican Party, that it actually had more potential to build a broad coalition if it was willing to disappoint its most intense activists a little more. And McKinley broke out of that pattern, and then both parties broke out of the pattern as a result. I think that's what it would take in this situation. And part of what that means is really recognizing that the system demands coalition building, that it demands more of a willingness to reach out to new voters.
Well, and also, I want to go through the institutions that are failing to live up to what they ought to be doing. The other reaction to that moment, to the paralysis of government in that time, and the sense that it was not catching up with the tremendous economic changes and social changes that were happening, was the progressive era, and the move of Americans during that era. You attribute a lot of the current misjudgments we have now to trends that began then in response to that previous period of narrowly divided country and governmental paralysis. So it's an interesting. I think the late 1800s is an understood time, highly relevant at our moment of AI, Gilded Age, Oval Office, AI, railroad bubble comparisons, and everything else that's going on right now. And it's a lot less known even to consiglienti as so many
Absolutely
of the
right.
things
And
that
the
happened
progressive
afterwards.
movement also is striking in that it reached across both parties. It spoke
And all levels of government.
and all levels of government, and it spoke precisely to frustration with the Constitution. I think we have a lot to learn from that time. Absolutely.
So let's start with Congress. And you say something that will surprise certainly a lot of people, which is Congress is supposed to be the preeminent branch. That was what was intended. As you say, that the United States Congress is the primary and predominant institution of the American system of government. This is true whether Congress behaves accordingly or not, and that Congress is broken. And so much of what's going on in this book and in our politics, whether it's the role of the presidency in this extraordinary expansion of presidential power that's being attempted, or the role of the Supreme Court, has to do with Congress not living up to its role, receding and not working. And why is Congress? What would you attribute as the reasons why Congress is not working right now, and why is it so supine to the executive at this moment?
Yeah, I think it's, first of all, very important to see that Congress is intended to be the driving force, or at least was expected to be the driving force in our system. The idea that we have three co-equal branches of government is an invention, literally, of Richard Nixon. The term co-equal is used in the Federalist Papers to describe the relationship between the national government and the states. Is absolutely not intended to describe the relationship between the branches of government. And the presidency is not co-equal with Congress. Certainly the courts are not. The Congress has all kinds of powers that they don't have. It controls their budgets. The Congress can impeach judges and the president and executive officials. They can't fire members of Congress. And ultimately, because it is representative and because of the fundamental nature of liberal democratic Republican government, the legislature is meant to be the preeminent branch and sets the tone for the system. That means that when Congress isn't working well, the system isn't working well, and it falls out of balance in very dangerous ways. So I worry a lot about presidential overreach in the 21st century, but I think we have to see that congressional underreach is the deepest problem, and it is often, not always, but often the cause of presidential overreach and of a kind of imbalance between the courts and the other branches too. Congress needs to be in the driver's seat, and when it doesn't want to be, it's very, very hard for the rest of the system to stay in balance. Nobody can force Congress to do anything. Congress has only powers. It has no duties in the Constitution, unlike the other two branches. And so the courts can't make Congress do its job. We've learned that because the courts have been trying to make Congress do its job now for a long time, creating all kinds of opportunities, but Congress declines to make use of them. And I think in part, the reason that's happened has actually had to do, ironically, with misguided efforts to strengthen Congress that have ended up weakening it, especially around the centralization of power in both houses of Congress. This is a trend that began in a rather mild way in the 1970s. You had a group of more progressive Democrats entering the House and finding themselves confronted with less progressive Democrats, Southern committee chairmen, who stood in their way on all kinds of issues they cared about, and they empowered the Speaker to override those committee chairmen and started to centralize power. But that really got moving when Republicans took control of Congress in 1994. And Newt Gingrich tried to create circumstances for himself to be able to stand toe-to-toe with the Democratic president. That meant he had to be able to say that he could wield the Republican Congress, and he centralized power to a tremendous degree in a way that really was unprecedented in the history of the American constitutional system. And that trend has then continued. It continued under Nancy Pelosi and Democratic control. It accelerated under Republican control in this century. And the effect of centralizing power in Congress, the intent was that Congress could be stronger in fighting the president. The effect was that most members of both houses were left with very little to do. And ultimately, these are ambitious men and women. They're not just going to sit around. They found something else to do.
That's what TikTok is for.
Exactly. They've discovered that they can advance their careers. If they're not allowed to write legislation, well, by golly, they can start a podcast. They can become famous on cable news, and they can build a following on social media, and they can become big players in the system in that way rather than by pursuing their legislative work. And the effect of it ultimately is that they become spectators and commentators, and what they talk about is mostly the presidency. And by now, a lot of the work of Congress, it's not even oversight. They're not even exercising oversight over the executive. They're just talking about the president. And they don't think of themselves as having the power to address the problems they talk about. They think that their only real role is to kind of channel frustration in the direction of the executive. That has created a very dangerous situation where our presidents now routinely take for themselves powers that belong to Congress, and Congress allows it. The framers of the Constitution would not have been surprised by a president who wants Napoleonic powers. They would have been worried about it, but they recognized that.
They talked about Cromwell all the time.
Exactly. They would have been very surprised, though, I think, by a Congress that allows that to happen and that lets its own power flow to the president. That's the big problem we face now, and I think reinvigorating Congress is the great constitutional challenge for the coming years.
Well, you really identify well this challenge in the House, which is the centralization of power in the leadership, the neutering of the committees and their role, which includes both their expertise, but also that's often where both parties work together most intimately. This has been something that's been going on even before the 1970s. You saw it in the 1920s and other times, but you're absolutely right about the recent and relatively recent era. The Senate is a different set of problems, and you are a big fan of the Senate and of its deliberative role, and whether it is the fact that each state gets 2 seats, which one of the things that I enjoy so much when I'm doing various writing is wading through the notes of the Constitutional Convention. Both Madison and Hamilton were both aghast at the Connecticut Compromise and the fact that the small states had as much representation as the big states. But you are a fan of the filibuster in particular, and I really wanted to ask you about that because the filibuster was used for big matters. It was used indeed for suppressing racial equality and for blocking civil rights bills more than anything else. But now, of course, it's used routinely pretty much for everything. And they knew that a legislature with a supermajority requirement was not a good idea. They gave Congress a supermajority requirement on treaties, but they knew that one of the problems with the Articles of Confederation was basically that there was a minority veto. Not that you don't have debate, not that you don't slow things down, right, but that basically you can't get stuff done. Why am I wrong on the filibuster? Why is this actually something valuable, not just to stop bad stuff? Yeah. So Trump right now says, I want to end the filibuster. And other people might think, well, I'm glad it's there because I don't want him to do the thing he wants to do. But that's not what you identify. You identify it more as an action-forcing mechanism to get people to compromise and talk to each other.
Right. So I'd say a few things here. I think the Senate, the way that the Senate has evolved in general in the last several generations now, is that it's tended to follow the House in the wrong direction. And changes in Congress have started in the House, And the Senate has become more and more like the House over time. And I think there, too, there's been a lot of centralization of power. The reasons for that have to do with a sense of what it is that's wrong in Congress. And that's where I think I disagree with a lot of people who think about congressional reform. Congress is dysfunctional. That's easy to see. But what is the function that Congress is failing to perform? I think the natural answer to that question that we all might think of first is it's not passing big legislation. The country has real problems. There are things that need to be done, and Congress is not acting on them. And whether you think that's the budget or whether you think it's immigration or the environment, whatever it is you worry about, you are correct to assume that Congress is not currently solving that problem. But I think that the deeper problem, the deeper dysfunction, the function not being served, is that Congress is failing to facilitate cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation in a divided country. That is the purpose of the institution. Now, that failure is also the reason why it's not passing big legislation, but it is a more significant underlying failure to facilitate bargaining and compromise. The diagnosis matters because if we think the problem is they're not passing big bills, then you want Congress to be more efficient. And so you want to centralize power. You want to get the committees out of the way. You want to get rid of the filibuster. You want to allow things to just move. But if you think the problem is Congress is not facilitating bargaining and accommodation, then you actually want Congress to be less efficient. You want it to be harder for narrow temporary majorities to get their way so that they have to deal with durable, long-standing minorities. And then it's decentralization that would help. Letting the committees work, that's where these weird kind of strange bedfellow coalitions can happen. Taking power away from leaders and channeling them toward the committees. And that is also the reason to see the filibuster as a constructive instrument, as I do. The filibuster is the only reason we've had any bipartisan legislation in the last 20 years. And getting rid of it would have allowed the narrow majorities we've had to get their way, and then to have their way reversed by the next narrow majority, and reversed again, and reversed again. And legislation would have looked a lot more like administration over the last 25 years, which has basically looked like whiplash.
You do mention this, and it's an interesting thing because none of us really want to think about these as major legislative achievements. But the times when Congress acted on a broad bipartisan basis on something big and didn't really worry about the filibuster was in the 2008 financial crash and COVID, when Congress acted really fast in a massively Keynesian way that nobody really would have thought was quite possible because of the exigency of the emergencies that they faced. And that was suddenly nobody worried about the filibuster.
Yeah, when they've really needed to. When
the space aliens are landing or the
when there's been an
crashing.
Obvious national need, yes, Congress can act. The 21st century Congress has acted pretty assertively in emergencies after 9/11, after the financial crisis, during COVID. We may not love what they did, but they did what seemed necessary in the moment, and they did it assertively. These longer, more durable challenges do require bargaining and compromise, and I think the filibuster makes it more likely, not less likely, that those could be achieved.
We could filibuster ourselves and spend the whole time talking about this. I've always felt that the way this filibuster is working now is not George Washington's metaphor of the saucer cooling the coffee poured into it by the House, but taking the coffee and throwing it out too much.
Well, let me say one thing, and I do mention this in the book. I think that the move toward dual tracking for the filibuster, and I'll say a word about what that is, was a mistake.
Letting
in the
them
1970s.
Filibuster without actually having to stand there and talk.
Exactly. So saying I'm filibustering this bill, and in the meantime the Senate can just keep doing its other work, makes the cost of the filibuster way too low, and it happens far too often now. I do think there should be a single-track filibuster so that when you filibuster a bill, the Senate is stuck. It can't do anything else. Members would be much less likely to use the filibuster then, but I will say they would still use it for the things that get us most worked up about the filibuster. So it would still be the case that it could compel some accommodation, but just routine, mundane, low salience legislation generally wouldn't get filibustered as much. So I do think that's a reform that could improve things.
A cousin to that, which Senator Tom Harkin used to advocate for, is that, but you start, and you might not agree with this, you start with the first cloture vote is 60, the second is 50, over after some period of time. The
Uh-huh.
second is 57. The third is 53. Then finally you can pass something by a majority. But that would only be one or two bills
Right.
every 2 years because of the amount of time it takes. And you would either gain public support or you would compromise or whatever. But it would have,
Yeah.
similar, I think, encouragement of actually legislating. The one thing I want to raise, because it's such an interesting idea, and you talk about it here and you've talked about it in other forums, is actually increasing the size of the House of Representatives. It actually would lead to better representation. It's a nod almost toward more proportional representation, but why is that a good idea?
Yeah, I mean, it strikes a lot of people as a strange idea because very few of us now look at the House and think, gee, I wish there were more of these people. But it is, I think, the purpose of the House of Representatives is to be representative of the American public, more so than any other institution. The House was also expected to grow with every census. It's part of the reason for the census. The idea that reapportionment and redistricting means keeping the same number of seats but dividing them differently is not how the framers assumed this would work. The House did grow after every census from 1790 until 1920. And that growth was ended by statute. It was ended, frankly, for reasons of a kind of alarm about Catholic immigration and the effects it would have on Congress. I don't think those reasons were legitimate, and they certainly weren't legitimate as a reason to keep the House at 435 members now for 100 years. The average House member now represents 750,000 people. It's very hard to really be a representative at that scale. And I think allowing the House to grow again would allow it to be a little more representative. It wouldn't totally transform the institution, but it would help. It would also, by the way, rebalance the Electoral College. The Electoral College delegation that each state has is just the number of members it has in Congress. And so allowing those to grow and to become a little more representative of population change would help the Electoral College be a little bit more representative as well. And it would create a moment of reform in Congress, a moment in which a lot of new members entered would be a time to rethink other things too, the budget process, the committee system. So I argue that we should now increase the size of the House to where it would have been if it had kept growing by the same formula that was applied until 1920. That would mean increasing the House by about 150 members all at once, and then letting it grow much more slowly by that same formula every 10 years.
I know a lot of state legislators who think that's a great idea because it would give them something to run for.
Exactly.
One of the crazy facts about the drafting of the Constitution is, as I understand it, the only time George Washington spoke on the record at the Constitutional Convention was the last day. And he said, I want to make sure that the size of congressional districts is small enough, 30,000 people, I think was the number, so that people actually could be in touch with their representatives. It was a profoundly democratic, small d democratic impulse.
Absolutely. And you know, we couldn't get to 30,000 now. That would mean a House of several thousand members. But we can certainly have a more representative legislature. Having 600 members wouldn't be that crazy. The House of Commons in Britain has 700 members. That's still a functional legislature. And I think there's room to grow the House.
Now let's talk about the president, who, as you say, members of Congress now see themselves both as partisans, but partisans of whoever the president is, if it's their party in power, and that presidents routinely misread their mandates and misunderstand their role. And you blame a lot of this on what would be called the progressive notion of the presidency, starting, as you identify it, with Woodrow Wilson. And I have always been one of those people who have looked at the history of the past, 150 years of the country and thought, well, one of the principal ways that progress has happened in the country is, in fact, when strong presidents summoning their use of the bully pulpit, summoning their political coalition, drive otherwise seemingly impossible change through the system, usually through legislation, not through executive action, whether it's Roosevelt with the New Deal or Johnson with civil rights or Reagan in the Cold War. So that has, I'm one of the people, and I think that's my read of how our country has grown stronger given all the changes. But you have a different view. You think that this Wilsonian notion is misguided. I don't want to caricature it.
I do agree that effective change requires presidents to drive legislation. I don't think our presidents actually think that anymore, but when you think about the real transformative presidents, at least since the beginning of the 20th century, those have generally been presidents who had tremendous legislative achievements. And so they set priorities, but then they allowed those to be negotiated through Congress. What came out at the end wasn't exactly what they wanted, but it moved meaningfully in the direction they wanted. And I do think that's what meaningful leadership looks like. But it's ultimately Congress that represents the interests of the people in that process, while the president sets some priorities. And I think it's important to recognize the character of the presidency in that story. What's striking about the way in which the authors of the Constitution thought about the presidency is that they did not think the presidency was a representative institution. They wanted the presidency to be elected so that the executive could be held accountable. But in a vast, diverse society, representation requires a plural institution. Congress represents the differences that exist in our country and is the place where those are worked out and negotiated. And presidents can set the terms of the questions that Congress takes up. They set priorities, but they don't decide the answers. Those happen through negotiation. And I think that was true of the Civil Rights Act in the middle of the century. That was true of parts of the Great Society. They had massive congressional majorities that enabled them to do what they did. It was true in the 1980s. Reagan had much smaller majorities, and so what he got was not exactly what he wanted, but he set the terms of the agenda.
And he did it by getting Democratic votes, like
exactly.
Phil Gramm of Texas when he was a Democrat.
Yeah, he did it by winning over some of the other party to his side, and again, participating in a process of negotiation. I think that at the core of the Wilsonian argument about the presidency, and Woodrow Wilson, it has to be said, was a brilliant political scientist before he ever ran for office. The only political scientist who ever became president.
The political scientists get a lot of grief in this book, whether they're in the Academy or in the White House, I have to say.
Yeah, fair enough. These are my people, so maybe I'm allowed, but I do think that we've done some harm in the way we've tried to think about changes in the system. Wilson's view was that the president is the most representative figure in American government because he's the only one who has a national constituency and the only one who can drive a kind of unitary vision. And that unitariness is really essential to Wilson's conception of what's required for government to work. Wilson almost rejects the notion that there could be any kind of acting together when we don't think alike. He thinks that government has to be moved by a cohesive, coherent, partisan vision, that elections are the time when the public declares which vision it wants, and between elections, the party that won should have all the power to pursue its ideas as far as it can go. It's not a crazy idea. This is how the Westminster system works. It's how many parliamentary democracies work. But the American system has always insisted that what you win when you win an election is not the power to do everything, but a seat at the negotiating table. And Wilson did not think that was enough for governing in a complicated modern world, and wanted a much more essentially unitary vision of government under a strong president. The way in which he thought that presidential power ought to work was both the bully pulpit. The president could speak for and to the country in a distinct way, but also that the system should basically be organized by the president's will, and that there should be much more power concentrated in the executive branch and in agencies that are kind of pseudo-executive than in Congress. Our system has obviously moved in that direction in very dramatic ways over the last 100 years. It's happened, I should say, under both parties. And in fact, I would argue that the most Wilsonian president we've had since Woodrow Wilson is Donald Trump, especially in this term. He explicitly argues that the president is the most representative, and his people do. And Stephen Miller constantly says the president is the only one who represents the whole society. He really is the one who has the legitimacy to act. And he operates from the sense that administrative action is government action. Donald Trump doesn't even have a legislative agenda at this point. There isn't even anything he wants Congress to be doing except getting out of his way. Um, I think that kind of approach to power in our system isn't how the presidency is meant to work, and that in fact the president's role, a key role for him beyond leading the country in foreign affairs, is facilitating what Alexander Hamilton called steady administration, a steadiness in the ways in which the laws are put into effect that allows people to make plans, that allows people to think about the future, to take risks. And the presidency now is a source of profound instability, and not only under Donald Trump, but in general, because of the way we think about administrative power.
But you say in the book that since George Washington, in a sense, the presidency has been the straw that stirs the drink, that it's been a source of instability, not just in the last decade or two, but for better or worse, going back throughout many other periods of history. And one of the ways to build stability was the creation of the administrative state, governed by the Administrative Procedures Act, including these independent agencies which Congress created. But you, in the book, support reducing the independence of those agencies. Wouldn't that give presidents more power?
Well, so there are a few things to be said there. I think that the nature of the modern administrative state begins from a kind of disagreement with the logic of the American constitutional system, and that the agencies created in the progressive era and then in further waves of agency creation in the 1940s and 1970s stand apart from the three branches of our government in ways that make it very hard to keep them accountable. And in that sense, the more power they have, the less our system is able to sustain its balance. Those agencies have to either be folded into the executive branch or into the legislative branch. They can't exist between them in the way that they now do. The work they do has come to be more and more like executive work. And so I think we're in a place now where it makes sense to think of these agencies as executive agencies. Allowing the president to control them would mean that the president controls the executive branch. And he does. The president has all the executive power under our Constitution. The first sentence of Article 2 is the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America, period. So that I think the kind of empowerment of the president to control these agencies is a separate matter from the question of whether the executive branch ultimately dominates American government, which, as we've said, I certainly don't think it does and should. So we're in a moment now where a lot of our administrative law debates, and a lot of this is left to the courts, of course, today, are about, on the one hand, centralizing executive power in the hands of the president, but on the other hand, making sure that executive power is not seen to be the dominant power in American government. The courts are in the weird position of having to strengthen Congress and the president at the same time. And I think they're right to do both, because the president should be empowered to control the executive branch, but the executive branch should not be empowered to control the direction of our government. And we've landed in this place in large part because Congress has allowed this confusion to persist and allowed its own power to flow to the president rather than just agency power.
So we have only a few minutes left. I want to ask you a quick question about the Supreme Court as it relates to Congress, and then somebody we haven't really talked about that much, pleasurably, I would say, Donald Trump. And how much does he represent all of these problems, and how much is he a break point? You talk about Congress being the legislature, being the place where consideration should be given, where compromise should happen, where the factions should work things out. On the issues the Brennan Center works on most, the Supreme Court has very aggressively and often using originalist rationales demolished the carefully constructed laws passed by Congress governing democracy. I'm thinking about Citizens United, which undid a century of campaign finance laws, the Shelby County decision in 2013, which gutted the Voting Rights Act, which had passed the Congress most recently in 2006, 98-0 in the Senate. Even the Warren Court, for all of its activism, and I wrote a book, even though we are named after Justice Brennan, criticizing the activism of the Warren Court, among others, they did not actually strike down a lot of laws passed by Congress. But this was an aggressive move by the Supreme Court toward Congress as handiwork, and that has shaped the politics we're in. You talk, and we won't have time to go into this in detail about the parties and their role in polarizing things, but the role of money in politics is a product of those Supreme Court decisions undoing what Congress did, and that role of money right now is one of the reasons they care about primaries, one of the reasons they're so unwilling to step up. How do you feel about the court and its relationship to those laws passed by Congress?
Yeah, I mean, this is a long story, and it would take a while, I think, to work through it. But my view is that the original statutes were a misguided attempt to fix a very real problem. And that the attempt to control campaign finance in the ways that Congress did in the 20th century they misplaced, it seems to me, where the real problem was. I think the law should have strengthened the parties rather than weakened the parties. It's a long story. On the other hand, I do think that the courts should be very reticent to pull apart and tear down legislation passed by Congress. They do it when they think that there are constitutional questions at issue, and the Constitution does have to override legislation, and they're right to think that. But I think there ought to be very great reticence in the courts to overturn legislation, especially now in this moment where legislative power is already weakened and precarious. I think Congress should show a lot of deference and preference for congressional action over administrative action. And so I think, generally speaking, the court should have a very high bar for overturning legislative bargains and accommodations, and that this court, if it intends and wants to strengthen Congress, as in its administrative law decisions it constantly says it does, absolutely should apply that same logic to the rest of its decision making.
So the last inescapable topic, this presidency. The book was written before this term, really. Is what we're seeing from Donald Trump this extraordinary attempt to expand presidential power. Is this a continuation, or does this go beyond what we've seen before in this aggrandizement of the presidency and the retreat from Congress? And maybe the courts, but Congress especially, from its responsibility.
Yeah, I actually think so far the administration has been pretty deferential to the Supreme Court. It's shown a lot of contempt for the lower courts, but it hasn't been contemptuous of the Supreme Court. But it absolutely has been rooted in the sense that Congress is just a useless appendage of American government. The president has essentially no use for Congress. I would say it is both an extension and a new height of trouble on this front. It is an extension of the logic of our 21st century politics. Our presidents, starting really in 2000, have increasingly asserted for themselves a variety of powers that more properly belong to Congress. But I think that President Trump, more than others, perceives himself as capable of governing on his own. And he does it to some degree by administrative action, but he does it in particular in a way that's really distinct to him, which is, I would say, by deal-making more than rule-making and law-making. So that he works institution by institution, reaching agreements using the enormous leverage of the administrative state to drive institutions in civil society and the private economy to accept various kinds of arrangements. And that is not a way to govern at all. So I think that there are enormous legitimacy problems with quite a lot of what this administration is doing, that this is, in a sense, an extension of where we've been headed, but that it is worse and significantly more dangerous than what we've seen before. And the way to answer it is really only through some kind of reassertion of congressional prerogatives. There's only so much the courts can do, even if the president does remain deferential to them, and we don't know if he will. There's much more that Congress can do. In all of the areas that have raised alarms, Congress has room to act and is choosing in this moment not to act. That's what really worries me most.
Well, that is a very powerful note on which to end. And when you look at even the most terrifying topics in some ways of troops on the streets. Congress can address the Insurrection Act, can address the Alien Enemies Act, the National Emergencies Act, where there's actually been bipartisan efforts over time, but even the Biden White House wasn't wildly enthusiastic about having those powers looked at. And this needs to be, I think, one of the agenda items going forward.
Absolutely.
I could ask questions for another hour or two, but we have to end, and we don't filibuster here. It's been a pleasure talking with you. This book, again, is called American Covenant. It should show, I hope, folks, that there are a lot of divisions in the country, but one of the leading voices at one of the leading conservative institutions has given very deep thought to what ails our system and really innovative solutions to a lot of these problems. And thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Briefing. We think this new podcast is a great format for going in greater depth on the challenges facing our country and how we can save it and renew our democracy. If you've enjoyed the show, please give us a boost by liking, subscribing, and sharing it with your friends. That's the way to get content out to the widest number of people. And if you are listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please leave us a 5-star rating. Thanks.